The following program is presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.
The historian Curtis put it very succinctly when he said that in the 5th century, the Irish were the most brutal and barbarous names to be heard.
KTCA TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis, presents Ireland Rediscovered, a series of 13 programs dealing with the significance of the Irish nation which has emerged to statehood in our own times. Dr. John McKiernan, head of the Department of English at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul and an authority on Ireland, is host and lecturer. The title of this program is Raider to Artist. Here again is Professor McKiernan.
The title of this program, Raider to Artist, we hope sums up the early history of Ireland, the first 9 centuries at any rate of the Christian era. When I use the Christian era, I'm thinking of it in the Western sense of the word and not particularly applicable to Ireland, since Ireland was not Christianized until the 5th century. So that in the program called Raider to Artist, we shall deal with the first 8 or slightly beyond 8 centuries of Irish history. We might begin our discussion by pointing out the pre-Christian, in the Western sense of that word, the pre-Christian invasion of Ireland by the Celts. This has been covered in a previous program. But simply by way of reminiscence, I would remind you that by the time of Christ's birth, the Gaels, the Gaelic invaders, who had come from the continent, were now in complete charge of Ireland. Their language, their laws, their institutions had a firm grasp upon the country. And by the time of Christ's birth, the country had already been divided into 5 major kingdoms. Those 5 portions of the country, by the way, which more or less correspond to the present 4 major divisions. Now, 2 centuries after Christ, we come upon the name of a great king, Conn Céad Cathach, he is called, which is simply the Irish for Conn of the 100 battles. He evidently didn't have too easy a time of it. Conn has given his name to a section of the western part of Ireland called Connacht. Now, Conn had a grandson, a very famous man, Cormac MacArt. His name was touched upon in a previous program as a great administrator, lawmaker, builder, a man who shaped the destinies of Ireland profoundly in those early days. I would remark that it was he who instituted the high kingship at Tara. And what little you may know about Irish history, I'm sure that you've come across the name of Tara. Now, another descendant, and more famous possibly, descendant of Conn, is a man by the name of Niall, N-I-A-L-L. You may, if you wish, give it the English pronunciation of Niall. Niall is not only the founder of that great family in Irish history, the O'Neills, but he is the man whose action, which I shall tell you about in a very few moments, had such a profound effect upon the course of Irish history. Niall reigned at Tara from about 380 AD to 405. And in the course of his kingship, one of his galleys brought back to the country a slave boy whose name was Patrick. Now, before we take up the question of Patrick, I should like to point out to you on a map a few significant characteristics of the geographic positions of Ireland and England. Note how close, of course, they are. Note the very narrow separation between Ireland and Scotland, the upper portion of the country. And note the relative closeness of Ireland and Wales. Above here, between Ireland and Scotland, you have barely 12 miles of water. Below that, you have hardly more than 60 miles of water. And these countries, situated so closely, were by fate, it seems, intermingled early in history. The Irish raided those coasts which were so close to them. In the 3rd century, the 4th century, and the 5th century, the Irish were a terror. Their very name shattered the morale of the people inhabiting the coasts of what we now call Scotland and what we now call Wales and Western England. The name of Ireland, or of the Irish raiders, pirates if you like, was something indeed to strike fear into the hearts of the people living on those coastal regions. At this time, the Irish had already earned a title, which is no longer used, but which described pretty accurately their activities in this manner. They were called in the Roman tongue Scoti, S-C-O-T-T-I, which is the Latin word for raiders, pirates, marauders, and so on. Now, the Irish earned this name simply because of their fearful and constant raids along the western coast of that island. And what is significant for history is that in one of these raids, up the river Severn, if we were to take this map, which of course is not meant to be in any great detail, if we take this map and notice this indentation at this point, this is the approximate location of the river Severn. And one of Neil's raiding parties sailed up there about 404 or 405. We can well imagine the consternation of the populace shouting, "Scoti, Scoti, Scoti, the Irish are here." And when that galley pulled away, there was aboard a young man whose life in Ireland was to change the course of Irish civilization. So that we can say anyone who studies Irish history is struck by the fact that the greatest event, certainly in those 8 or 9 centuries of the year of our Lord, the greatest event was the Christianizing of the country. This was accomplished chiefly through Patrick. I am not going to go into the debate now about whether there have been 2 Patricks or not, whether there had been a bishop previously operating in Ireland. In all likelihood there was. But the credit for the Christianizing of Ireland goes to this man whom we know now as Patrick. And very briefly, I might point out a few significant features of his life. This raid took place when he was about 16 years of age. So far as we know from his own autobiography, he was simply the average young man of his time, not particularly attracted to sanctity, not attracted to the clerical state of life or anything of this sort, but an average young man, ripped from the family, taken from the country of his birth, and transported now to an alien country, to a country whose inhabitants were symbols for terror and fright. We know enough about him to be able to say that a petty chieftain by the name of Miliuk took him in trade and put him to tending sheep and swine on a mountain called Slimish in Northern Ireland. Now, Patrick spent 6 years there, 6 very difficult years, because they were filled with the searching of soul. Was there any meaning that this should have happened to him, that he should be so thrust into degradation, into toil, into servitude? And he reminisced in these 6 years over his life, and he gradually turned to contemplation and prayer. And then one time, following the directions he received in a dream, he escaped and made his way to France, where, with the exception of one brief trip back to Britain, where, with that one exception, he spent the next 20 years of his life. He prepared for the priesthood, he became a clergyman, and he tells us in all of this time, by day and by night, he was tormented by voices calling, the voices of the Irish, calling him to come back. He tells us this feeling was with him constantly. Come back to us. Come back, O holy youth, to us. So that eventually he petitioned for and was commissioned as a bishop to Ireland, where he went, we know, in the year 432. He spent the next 29 years of his life there, dying in 461, having given his best efforts to this country to which he had first been so unwillingly brought and which he had come to love, whose customs, whose language he had come to understand. Now that is the event which was of such profound importance in the history of the Irish nation that it must be taken in, with some detail and treated with great importance. Patrick then brought Christianity, but what was Christianity? It was a religion that was accompanied by the learning of the classical world. Now this is of extreme importance. If Christianity had been a religion transmitted without an accompanying culture, well, maybe what happened wouldn't have happened. But Christianity at that time followed, even for its patterns of organization, it followed Roman models. So that wherever Christianity went, the classical civilization of Greece and Rome also went. And normally speaking, when this civilization entered a land, it submerged all before it, simply because where it went generally had a lower level of civilization. But a most interesting thing took place in Ireland. Before the advent of Christianity, the Irish had their schools, they had a literature, they had a great reverence for law, for order. They had really all the characteristics of a fine civilization. When the Roman civilization, with the introduction of Christianity, met this, there was a merging, a fusion of the two, and not a replacement of one by the other. There was this interpenetration, so that both gained something from it. Now, one of the most interesting characteristics of the Roman penetration was the introduction of writing. You may ask, had the Irish no writing? Yes, the Irish had a writing, but it was a very awkward writing. You may see from this example just how awkward. It was a system of straight lines, you see, not fitted for manuscript writing, although well suited to monuments. You see here an example of this kind of writing inscribed on a monument, and that was its most useful function. Now, the Roman alphabet was a much greater improvement over this, and it was immediately adopted. It was as though the people had been searching for some far more effective method of writing than the method I have just shown you. But at any rate, the impact of writing in Ireland can be very well compared to the impact of printing later in the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe. And you know a great deal about that, and you can compare it to this introduction of Roman writing. Now, this meant that Ireland had the gift of a classical curriculum. It was not a question merely, you see, of the old curriculum, the oral traditions of the Irish, which now could be committed very effectively and very economically through a new system of writing. But it was also the introduction of a whole classical curriculum, something new, something that was the best thesaurus, if you will, the treasure house of the ancient world. What was the effect upon the Irish character? The new did not displace the old was too good. the new and the old, mingled, commingled, interpenetrated one the other. And we had a remarkable renaissance, rebirth, stimulation of learning in Ireland. We had, for instance, the spread of a great many schools, many of these enrolling thousands of students, as early as the late 5th and early 6th century. I could mention such famous names as Clonard, St. Enda's, Bangor, from which Columbanus went, for instance, to travel all about Europe. But I'd like very shortly to mention Clonmacnoise, for instance, which founded in the 6th century, 548, lasted until 1552, at which time it was destroyed by the English soldiers who took away the stained glass windows, the art treasures, manuscripts, and so on. And today we have only these ruins by the side of the Shannon to show what remained of a glorious university tradition as early as the 6th century. However, the factor of these Irish monastic schools, which is of supreme importance to me in presenting this lecture to you now, is their manuscript work. The Irish brought to the greatest peak of perfection the art of illuminating manuscripts. And their name is forever associated, for instance, with the town of Kells in Ireland, not very far from Dublin. And the book that was produced there in the late 8th century, the early 9th century partly, is one of the world's masterpieces of art. I'm going to show you pages illustrating the technique of that work. You see here before you now a page from the Book of Kells. The Book of Kells, I should have told you, of course, is a collection of Gospels. A page here listing the canon of the Gospel. Now, you note its architectural form. If you'll pay a bit of attention to the upper half above the columns, I'll show you a close-up, not of this page, but of a similar page, so that you may appreciate the detail and the complexity to be found in this kind of illumination. All done with remarkable patience and in the most brilliant and lasting colors. You'll appreciate that when you remember that the book is 1,100 years old, and especially in the early centuries of its existence, led a very precarious life. We have, for example, some illustrations, full-page illustrations of people. The Irish made no attempt to make the figures representational. All of these were subdued to a conception on the part of an artist for form and line. This is the Virgin and Child. And again, to impress upon you how much is put on one page, let me magnify one portion of this. If you will look to the right of the Virgin's knee, you'll see something which is probably barely distinguishable as a break in the margin. But note what it is. It consists of a portrait of 6 people who are listening, as it were, to all that the Virgin and the Child mean. Now, here is a cross with the symbols of the 4 evangelists. And if I magnify merely one of those, you will note again how much is compressed in so brief a space. If you could see these in color, you would marvel at how the brilliant blues and the bright greens, the solid golds and the browns and the blacks have persisted over the centuries. We have here, for instance, a picture of Christ set in such a colorful frame as I have just mentioned. A remarkable page, but again, it would need almost a magnifying glass to study each position. Here is a manuscript page with a large capital letter, because this is beginning a preface from the Gospel of Matthew. One portion of that page I shall magnify for you in just a moment. If you let your eye wander to the lower left portion, to that large letter, study it for a moment before we now show you an elaboration of that. Notice the faces, the interlacing, the swirling, the complete abandon, and even the humor, if it's perceptible to you, of the interlacing qualities of this initial. Now we have another large page where this is given over to the words announcing the crucifixion of Christ. And the words themselves form a cross, and the most elaborate and the most complex interlacing of many, many varied kinds. There are many figures, many faces on this page. Again, it could be studied for a great time. But these are the examples, magnified here to a number of dimensions. These are examples of what are used for the interlacing and for the decorative effects. The last one was trumpet and spiral. This is an example of what can happen when snakes, you notice the snakes' heads, are interlaced to form simply a minute part of the printed page. The same is done here with foliage. Now, all of these can be combined in the presentation of a large initial letter. Having seen the previous portraits of decoration, you may then appreciate the difficulty of making such an initial as this, and it's only one of ever so many in the book. Now, I should like to remind you that this tradition, this book from the 8th and very early 9th century, this book is in the tradition. It's in an evolutionary tradition of Celtic art that has its antecedents back 1,000 years to the time when the Celts inhabited the continent. This illustration, for instance, of a metal collar called a torque, which has been found in Württemberg in Germany, will illustrate for you the point that I make about the relationship in Celtic art from pre-Christian to Christian times. We can go on to show you an example of a brooch which was manufactured, if that is the proper word for an artistic work, manufactured in Ireland about the 8th century. If one puts a magnifying glass to this, note the detail that is to be seen. This is only one of several. The Ardagh chalice is another such example from roughly the same period. A very complex piece of work. Again, if it's examined in detail, it may enable us to appreciate the complexity of the artist's work. Over 300 separate pieces of silver make up this particular work. Thus, we may appreciate what Francois Henry meant by the remark that Irish metalwork was certainly the finest, most complex, most artistic elaboration of the art to be found in the whole of Western Europe. Now, this long history from pre-Christian times, you will remember that torque that I showed you from continental Europe. From pre-Christian times down to the 8th and 9th centuries after Christ in Ireland, this long, continuous development is an illustration of the fact that what happened in Ireland through the influence of Christianity was not a displacement of an old culture, but an enrichment of it. The traditional Irish culture was not replaced by a better, but it met on an equal basis a culture which was completely foreign to it and which had a great deal to give, to contribute. And it was the intermarriage of these two, the assimilation of the continental gift of classical culture, that Christianity brought to Ireland. It's a most remarkable thing that this should have taken place. The Gaels themselves realized it well. They were a proud people. They did not succumb, as it were, or subject themselves to an incoming influence, but they readily grasped it. And that influence was to reform them, as the historian Curtis put it in a very succinct statement. The introduction of Christianity turned the Irish from a race of cruel conquerors whose galleys were dreaded on all the coasts of Britain and Gaul, into a race whose enthusiasm was for missionary labor, Latin learning, and the contemplative life. No name, he says, sounded more barbarous and brutal than that of the plundering Scots, which you will remember was the old name for the Irish. But to later centuries, no name was sweeter or nobler. Now this is the summation of the influence of Christianity, the historical introduction of Christianity into Ireland. It produced this renaissance of effort. It turned the Irish from plunderers, from raiders, to artists, to missionaries, to men who became, if you will, a new kind of raider, seeking a new kind of plunder. From the raiders for physical booty, they became the raiders now who insisted upon foisting upon the people whom they visited their own culture, their own contribution, their own amalgam of classical and native learning. This remarkable assimilation that took place in Ireland was not allowed, of course, to proceed unmolested. For 1,000 years, counting a few centuries before Christ and 7 or 8 after Christ, for 1,000 years, the Gaelic civilization had been blossoming in Ireland and had brought Ireland to a remarkable pitch of civilization, far superior to most of the continent in the 8th and 9th century. But at that moment, as it so often happens in the affairs of men, at that moment, an interruption that was fateful came. It came in the person of the Viking invaders who terrorized the coasts of Ireland for 2 centuries, but who appeared first in the last few years of the 8th century, burning, looting, and plundering. And they raised the question, the great question, in the minds of contemporary scholars in Ireland: could this nation survive? Could this nation arm itself once more to become as aggressive as it once had been? Or had Christianity so enervated and debilitated the country with its doctrine of love and peaceful effort, the contemplative life and learning? The question was, at the end of the 8th century, was Ireland too effete to maintain itself against this great new threat that the Vikings posed?
Ireland Rediscovered is produced by KTCA TV, Twin Cities Area Educational Television Corporation. The next title in this series is Doom to Doom. Host and lecturer is Dr. John McKiernan. Ireland Rediscovered is directed by Carl Brookins and produced by Joseph McDermott. This program was presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.